Hello everyone, this is Deepa Iyer and I am with the Building Movement Project. Excited that folks are joining us for another edition of our 10 Social Change Roles Explained series. Really glad to see you here, whether you're watching live or whether you're watching later. We are really happy that you are able to join us and sending everyone care, sending everyone solidarity wherever you are joining us from. So for those of you who have been with us over this series, every single month this year, I believe, we have done a breakdown of the 10 social change roles in the social change ecosystem framework. And we've been breaking them down month by month. We are talking today about frontline responders. So if you have questions for what that role is about, or if you have questions more generally on the social change ecosystem framework, please feel free to put them into the chat. I also wanted to thank my amazing colleagues at the Building Movement Project and Solidarity Is for being here. They will be putting links into the chat with resources that you can look at both during this session and later on if you want to learn more about the social change ecosystem framework. So as we get started and as folks are coming into the space, again, welcome to everyone. My name is Deepa Iyer. I am with the Building Movement Project, and I wanted to give you all a quick overview of the social change ecosystem framework in case you're new to it. So this is a framework that I developed last year, came out last year during the pandemic, and it basically offers people and organizations and coalitions a way of understanding what are the roles that they play and show up in order to advance their social change values. What are the roles that they might aspire to? What is the impact of playing certain roles? And how can we all support other people in our ecosystem, other organizations in our ecosystem by having a deeper awareness of the roles that we play? So if you've seen the ecosystem framework, and we'll put the link into the chat as well, you'll know that there are 3 components to it. The first component is really looking at the core values, the shared values that we have, which is in the middle circle of the framework. Then there are 10 roles that the framework has in it. They range from visionary to frontline responder, which we'll be talking about today, to disruptor, to guide, storyteller, and so on and so forth. And each of those roles has certain skill sets, certain areas of growth, certain ways that these roles support each other. And then finally, the entire framework is rested in this idea of an ecosystem, that when we have strong, robust ecosystems where there is interdependence, where there are shared values, where there is a focus on preservation of relationships, where there is a real understanding that we can be in space together even when there is conflict. How do we create an ecosystem like that in order to advance what we care about when it comes to social change? And there are so many issues right now, right? I think that continue to remind us that there is a lot of work to do when it comes to social change, when it comes to solidarity, when it comes to movement building. So that's a really quick intro. You can learn more at buildingmovement.org or go to the link tree here on our Instagram handle or on mine, Deepa V. Iyer, to learn more about the framework. We also, in addition to this series, do trainings and workshops for lots of different partner groups around the country. So please reach out to us if you are interested in that. All right, so today we're going to be talking about frontline responders, which is a role on the social change ecosystem framework that's quite dear to me, actually. And that is because I have played that role quite a lot in my own work Some of you might know that a lot of my work stems from the backlash that happened after 9/11. And as you know, this month in September, earlier this month, we marked the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and its aftermath. And so I kind of trace my work of being a frontline responder to that time of addressing the backlash of hate violence and state violence experienced by South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh immigrant communities all around the country. And I think it's a role that I kind of learned to hone and flex. It's a muscle. Rapid response oftentimes is a muscle that kind of is always ready, right? Is always vigilant, because what it's about really is community defense. It's about protecting communities. It's oftentimes about mutual aid. It's about being an upstander rather than a bystander. It is about being ready to respond when there is crisis. So whether that is, climate disasters or hate violence or police brutality, it's about being ready to assist when there are lots of people coming together. So for a rally or a vigil or a protest. So there are lots of ways in which frontline responders play their roles. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about where we see frontline responders, what the impact is of being a frontline responder, and what are the ways in which there's also room to grow when it comes to being a frontline responder. So as I've been doing in this particular series, there are times when I have been asking folks to join in terms of having a conversation with us about the role that they play. So I'm going to invite Robyn Ayers to join us, and let me get that. So as Robyn is joining us, I wanted to again thank you all for being here. Hi, Robyn. And drop any questions that you might have in the chat about frontline responders, about the social change ecosystem framework, and of course any questions you might have for Robyn, whom I will introduce you to right now. So Robyn is a movement artist, facilitator, writer, and trainer whose politics come from a commitment to transformative justice, mutual protection, and seeing the world through the lens of artistic narrative. They work as tactical support for protests and demonstrations, facilitate upstander intervention trainings, and write about spirituality and social justice. So I'm really excited that you are here with us, Robyn, and really looking forward to getting to know you better in your role as a frontline responder. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Great. And I want to actually just dive in, right, and talk a little bit about when you realized that I'm sure you play many roles, but when did you realize that one of the roles that you play is that of a frontline responder?
Yeah, I think the beginnings of the roots of that realization happened several years back. I was at an action for Eric Garner and had broken pretty much all of the protest safety rules. I was like freshly 18. I was alone. I did not have a check-in or check-out buddy. All I had with me was like my inhaler and the National Lawyers Guild number written in Sharpie on my arm. And I ended up in a kettle in Times Square until about 2 o'clock in the morning. And the reason that's so significant is because I saw the emergence of a frontline response network like coalesce in front of my eyes. A lot of it was made up of Black women who were checking in on each other, checking in on the people who were obviously there alone, making sure that everyone had safe rides home, passing on information for those of us who were new to this space and didn't know like what to expect. Like, did a kettle mean that we were all getting arrested? Alongside a variety of other questions. So that was kind of the roots of the beginning of my arc, I'd say, really coming to the realization that there is an ecosystem of care, and that for me, that was a realization that there was a world possible beyond what I had already experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So that was probably the very initial hints of that. So then once it came to the uprisings of May 2020, I already had some sort of an idea that that's where I was supposed to be. Um, the difficulty then there was that I wasn't really connected to any particular organizations or groups at the time. I didn't really know anyone. So I just started showing up really every day. I picked an action. I showed up. I stayed until it was over or until I could no longer risk arrest. And then within a week or so, I'd started to identify the activists who were kind of on the ground solo, or at least didn't have a like on the ground support network. Like the really strong like visionaries and disruptors who needed like frontline responders and builders and caretakers. Up until that point, and by that point I mean like the week prior, I'd been showing up mostly as a demonstrator, but it very quickly became clear to me that there were a lot of unmet needs on the ground. Things that I could do even though I didn't necessarily know anyone or belong to a collective, etc. So then I just started to plug myself in wherever I could. I started, tracking police response and reporting it to the head of the march. I would run ahead this was before like bike marshal groups were a thing. I would run ahead on the route and scout and let march leader know like what the streets looked like. I would talk to drivers who didn't understand why there were 100 people in the middle of their route home from work. And then I would walk minors to the train station when things started to escalate and they had to like get out of space. And then over time, I stopped like doing it by myself and found other folks to work alongside. And it got to the point where, especially in like the density of New York City spaces, folks started to like recognize like me and my trio, and knew what to expect from us. Which is all to say that I've been doing the work for a while, but really stepped into frontline response work consciously about a year and a half ago.
Thanks, Robyn. And so much of what you said, I want to just emphasize because I think it's so helpful. I really appreciated that, you talked about how you began to play this role after observation and like seeing what is out there rather than just sort of like jumping in. And I think that's something that in this framework we try to convey, the importance of like looking around and seeing what is the need. And that ecosystem that you talked about was the site of a protest. So what are the needs there? And then also recognizing that there were people playing certain roles, right? There might have been a visionary making a speech. There might have been, caregivers who were making sure that folks had water, like understanding that other roles are kind of happening in the ecosystem. And then I also really appreciated how you talked about the skills the activities that you engaged in, because a lot of times when we think about frontline responders, I think people aren't entirely sure what are the activities and steps, right? So I really appreciated how you talked about that. I have a follow-up, which is how did you figure out what to do, right? And also how were you received by others? So for example, when you stepped in to run to the head of the march and told folks what was happening, or escorted minors to the subway station safely. For those who want to play this role, embody this role, what advice can you give in terms of knowing what to do? And number two, how were you received when you offered these actions?
Mm-hmm. The primary piece of advice I give, and this is just kind of blanket statement always, regardless of role or tactic or space or whatever, is center consent. Don't enter these spaces with an idea of what needs to be done. The role of a frontline responder and the role that I found myself in is like gathering information and then presenting it to people, and then they choose what their steps are. They choose what their comfortable risk level is. So yes, centering consent always. Like if I was coming up to a minor, it was because I had already seen that they were looking panicked and looked like they needed a way out. And so I have something to offer, not saying, hey, it's time for you to leave, but I know there's a train station nearby. Would it be helpful for you if I walked with you to get there? So not deciding what the right or wrong thing is to do in a situation, but knowing my own skill sets, presenting them to people, and then giving them the choice whether or not they opt in or opt out. And then as far as like response goes, because I centered consent from the get-go, like I was received pretty well, and I'm still received well because I don't make choices for other people. And I don't, and this is kind of a side effect of a positive side effect of moving into these spaces without any like real connections or organizational backing or what have you, because what I had to back me was the integrity of my words and my choices. I wasn't like floating around on like the ego of a name brand or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really helpful too, because oftentimes people will ask, well, how can I step into a role like this if I'm not affiliated, right? And I really appreciate your answers, because you don't have to always be affiliated to play these roles. It is really about gathering information, like you said, seeing what's needed, and stepping in with, you know, some questions or alternatives, and centering consent and permission, receiving permission before taking an action. So
Absolutely.
thank you for that. And just for folks who are joining us, welcome. I'm in conversation with Robyn Ayers about the role of the frontline responder, which is part of the social change ecosystem framework, and we are taking a deeper dive into it. If you have questions about frontline responders, please feel free to put them into the chat. Robyn was just talking about how frontline responders, and you yourself, Robyn, are often seen at the scene of, you know, a protest or a gathering, a vigil, a march. Absolutely. We also see frontline responders in other contexts. So just to name a few, we might see frontline responders show up when there is some sort of disaster in the community to perform mutual aid or to construct mutual aid. We might see frontline responders show up as community defenders. So if there is a need for protection to protect a community, we might see them come in terms of even in terms of an organizational space, right? To be the responder if an organization is under threat. So there are lots of different ways that frontline responders show up. And I'm curious, Robyn, if you can talk a little bit about what are some of the strengths you feel folks need to have or skills they need to develop beyond the ones you mentioned, like around observation, data gathering, centering, consent. Are there other skills or strengths you feel are important to be a frontline responder? I talked earlier about sort of it's like a muscle, you know, that you need to, that oftentimes gets built and flexed and honed. So I'm just curious how you would, how you think about like skills and strengths.
Yeah, I don't know that I would say that this is necessary for anyone who wants to do frontline response work, but a skill that I have that definitely enhances that is the fact that I have a really strong multitasker brain. I am very effective at doing many different things at the same time without like missing out on details. A good example of this is the way that I facilitate meetings on Zoom. I'm the type of facilitator who's like running the agenda and keeping track of stack and responding to the chat and also taking notes and keeping the conversation moving. My brain likes to map narrative. So having all of these moving pieces in my head allows me to zoom in and zoom out as needed and as necessary. That ability to get really minute in the details if I need to, but also keep the bigger picture in mind, I think is a really strong skill set to have. And I think for also, I don't want to say that you have to, right? I don't want to prescribe in that way, but something that's really crucial is being really patient about hearing and identifying the unmet needs that inform our decisions and our behavior and our words.
Right.
For me, that like this is what makes me a good de-escalator, and it helps me to build relationships with people that I may not have known for a super long time because I know how to listen. And so perhaps the advice there is to be an effective frontline responder, you have to be willing to like drop your own ego and your ideas of what the situation is and figure out what the needs are, what the underlying emotion is that the other person or the other community is telling
Right.
you.
Yeah. And so to me, I also hear that is don't make assumptions, or don't bring your own biases and assumptions into this space. That if you are coming into a space that you don't know, sometimes frontline responders are in spaces that they know well. And they're working with people that they know. But in other cases, like you said, if it's a site of a protest, for example, they might not. And so dropping the assumptions, dropping the ego is super important. Another thing that I often hear about frontline responders, or I should say I have observed, is the ability to stay almost kind of calm in a scene of chaos, because a lot of times frontline responders are responding to, and I don't mean chaos in like a negative way. I just mean it in terms of there's a lot of external stimuli happening at the same time, right? So like if there is, for example, I was talking earlier about like the post 9/11 backlash, and there were lots of emails going around on listservs. There were people who were talking about this is what we should do, or that's what we should do. There was the importance of reaching out to survivors to understand what they needed, right? So there was so much external stimuli that happens. How is it important for frontline responders to develop the ability to stay calm in that moment, to receive the information, parse it out? What are some skills you've been able to develop in that vein?
Yeah. So I think what you're kind of getting at there is that in order to do frontline response work, you kind of have to have a really well bolstered window of tolerance. You need to be able to kind of handle things without, while still staying like conscious of your thoughts and your behavior and your choices. I find that really important to talk about with nuance, because sometimes that can be misconstrued to mean that frontline responders have to be willing to take an immense amount of harm or take on that harm, or intentionally put themselves in highly traumatizing situations. And that's not the case. We all have like different capacities on different days from moment to moment. But there is definitely a need for a level of comfort with discomfort.
Yeah.
You need to be able to separate like discomfort from a lack of control. Being able to be comfortable in, hey, this isn't a great situation, and I am still responsible for whatever I choose to do next. And that requires a lot of honesty, and a lot of bravery on, what are my triggers? What makes me like feel like I can't handle this anymore? And then balancing that with the other people in your frontline response network. Like some people, if like things get too chaotic, they're, trying to start a fight. Other people are more likely to freeze. So what does it mean when we're able to build in that interdependency with one another? That's why frontline responders often are like need to work as a like ecosystem in and of itself. Like we need to be able to lean on each other and not make up for other folks' like inadequacies or whatever, because that's not the point at all, but rather like figure out how we can bolster each other in the spaces where the different skill sets overlap.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, what I'm hearing you say is that it's important for frontline responders to work with other frontline responders in a particular situation, because as you say earlier, there might be parameters that like I might be able to go to, but then there's a boundary for me. And then if I have others who are able to kind of go from there to another boundary, that is helpful. So being honest with myself as well as other frontline responders is critical. And I appreciate that. I think you said well bolstered. Well, I can't remember now the rest of what you said. Do you remember?
Um,
We'll have to play that back.
yeah.
We'll remember it.
Yeah.
That was a gem. Yeah, no, but what I heard from that, right, or interpreted in my mind was that there is this real awareness of how much I can go or how far I can go, right, and the ability to be uncomfortable with discomfort, because it is really tough, right, to be a frontline responder. You have to not just kind of parse out all the stimuli that are happening, but you might have to be in situations where you don't feel comfortable. So I appreciate, like, again, what I keep hearing is this ability to be aware, this ability to know yourself really well. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about, we always talk about like room to grow. Like we're not all, we're all in a journey, we're all learning to sort of play whatever role that we play with intention and in a way that serves others, right? So what are some areas you feel that there's room to grow when it comes to being a frontline responder?
You cut out just for a second. Can you say that again?
Yeah. What are some areas of growth when it comes to being a frontline responder, whether that's skills or whether that's, finding that ecosystem that you talked about? What do you feel from your vantage point?
In terms of growth, I think it's important for frontline responders to keep in mind, just because you have a role doesn't mean that you're right. Because frontline responders are often like responding to crisis or conflict or need or chaos. If we're not careful, we can get stuck in this like tunnel vision of fix it, or like this is the right way. And this is kind of where I see the influence of whiteness and the patriarchy showing up in frontline responder spaces. There's like this deep scarcity and like need to prove that you belong by like fixing things and like solving the crisis, that you kind of, if you're not careful, you just barrel ahead with whatever you think you can do. And this goes back to the earlier point on consent. Sometimes you can't fix it. Sometimes like someone is just asking you to like be there as a witness. So like to engage in social change spaces and to grow as a frontline responder, you really have to be willing to leave your ego at the door. And you also have to be able to hold that wound that says you don't belong here with like compassion and care, while not allowing it to drive your decisions and your behavior. And then recognizing that another one of the reasons that frontline responders tend to jump directly to solution and to solving the crisis is because we care.
Right.
And we don't want people to be hurt. And for me, at least, recognizing that that's where that impulse comes from and being able to hold and honor where that fear lives and why allows me the like wider space to care and to be afraid, but also not let it drive my decisions at a pace that is faster than the consent that I need to get. Yeah, just
thank you for that. Thank you.
The growth is in
No, that's great. That's super helpful. I appreciate that. And I also am hearing there's so much, right, to hold. It's not as simplistic. It's not that any of these roles are like simple to play, but there is a lot to be aware of inside ourselves, in the spaces we're in understanding where our motivations are coming from in terms of, addressing the crisis or wanting to fix something, the culture in which we operate, the impact of whiteness. So I really appreciate you bringing all that to the fore for us. And I'm curious, you spoke earlier about others that are also in the ecosystem. And I'm curious about who have been your guides. Like, who do you turn to? The guide is another role in the ecosystem. So
Mm-hmm.
who have been your guides, or what kinds of practices have been your guides in order to help you hone these skills and be aware of the room to grow?
Yeah. I think, honestly, I think an easier question for me to answer would be who haven't been a guide to me. I am constantly learning a lot from everyone that I am around always. Um, and I especially learn from people who are very different from me. I'm a very empathetic person, and I sometimes have a really difficult time disagreeing with something up front or being critical of something up front. Um, I'm good at the like yes and not so great at the no but, at least not at first. um, I haven't really given like my somatic system has a really hard time like giving itself permission to say no in the moment. So I learned a lot from folks who can like have the awareness to be like, actually, no, I don't think so, and here's why. Um, yeah, and I'm guided a lot by my like meditation practice, and my movement practice, and being taking time to practice what it means to be aware of my somatic responses. Um, because in order to be able to acknowledge that honesty in times where things are more heightened or more chaotic or what have you, being able to practice that as like care, um, in times where I can find that calmness has been absolutely necessary. And then
Yeah.
I would also be like completely and incredibly remiss if I didn't name Kalyan Mendoza as one of my guides. And they're going to pretend to be annoyed that I name dropped them, but it's fine. Um,
They're here.
I met
Watching.
um, I I met Kalyan last year at the first iteration of the Brooklyn Liberation March. And by that point in time, I'd already somewhat plugged myself into Frontline response networks. Um, but I was having a really difficult time putting words to the dissonance that I was feeling with the way that structural whiteness was driving a lot of frontline responder spaces. And then I ended up showing up to a call that they put out for street marshals, and then just like sat back and watched in like total and complete awe at the way that holistic safety and humanity was like centered and celebrated, even when we had like such a significantly serious task ahead of us. And then just like hearing the language that I'd been like searching for to describe the type of frontline responder work that I wanted to be a part of. So then I just thought to myself, well, I need to learn from this person forever. And so I will now appoint myself his number one groupie and follow him everywhere until he notices me.
Well, obviously that's work. No, and the reason I asked you the question, right, is because I had a feeling that there were these practices that are grounding you, because I think that that it's really important, and I just want to rename some of them. Somatic mindfulness of how our bodies react in times of crisis and chaos, meditation, really, body movement, right? And so for frontline responders, these are really important practices, because you might have to kind of rely on them at times to kick in, right? Like the muscle to kick in. And so being aware, being mindful is really, really important. And speaking of, some of the resources, I think we're going to drop some of the resources that you had shared with us earlier, Robyn, into the chat. But I'm curious if you could, what are some resources people can go to if they want to learn about frontline response, or if they want to plug into some of the networks that you mentioned?
Yeah. So one of the resources that I sent you earlier is a like comprehensive protest safety guide, and that's a resource by Across Frontlines, which is a like training and facilitation on like protest safety and human rights defense, and it's incredibly comprehensive on like what it means to have safe practices on the ground, what it means to have a check-in and check-out buddy, what it means to have a go bag, as well as like guiding questions for like, when do you stay, when do you go, things like that. There's also for like your like physical safety, there's Portland Action Medics. There's a lot of really great resources on their Instagram. Yes, their Instagram page on like things that are more geared towards high escalation direct action spaces. So like, you know, how to do an eye flush, like how to pack a wound before you can get to medical attention, things like that. Those are the two
Great.
primary resources that come to mind.
Great. Thank you for that. And for folks who have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, or if you yourself play the role of a frontline responder, let us know sort of how you play it, because we've talked about various different contexts that frontline responders show up in our ecosystems. So I want to transition to a little bit around capacity and sustainability, which is one of the things that, you know, I think is important to talk about when we talk about social change roles. And perhaps it's really important, right, when we think of our frontline responders who are, again, in engaging in places or sites of conflict and chaos. How does playing this role, you know, affect you psychically, emotionally, spiritually, and how do you navigate those effects, right? And what can we learn from what you've learned and identified in your own work as a frontline responder?
Yeah. Frontline responder work is deeply exhausting on so many levels. And it can be isolating as well. When a lot of your community relationships are based on co-experiencing something that is very stressful or chaotic or traumatic, when all of your memories with like a particular group are like kind of tinged with like red on the outskirts, can be really like disheartening and scary. And I don't mean to be like a total downer about the work, and the reason I start there is because this time last year, I really needed someone to give me permission to take a break. Like, because of the nature of frontline response work, you have to proactively look for the good. You have to look for the joy and the breath and the imagination and the pause and giving yourself time to process. Otherwise, you just get sucked down this really draining, like, scarcity mindset. I found as a frontline responder that it exists in a cycle for me. It goes to like frontline response to like recuperation, rest, rejuvenation, and like preparation to start again. And giving myself permission to exist in like full honesty of whatever part of the circle that I'm in is like the core tenet of this, like the sustainability of the work. And so if I'm in like the rest or rejuvenation part of it, I'm limited on my social media presence. I'm not in the channels that are dedicated to like jail support networks or, cop monitoring or things like that. Giving my like whole system a chance to actually take a break and reset, and then also holding and challenging the guilt that comes from taking a break. Because that's a hard thing for a lot of folks. It's like, well, if this is my role, then this is what I have to be doing. And recognizing where that like impetus comes from, that like that drive to always be on, that drive to always produce. What is that? That's like a desire to belong and to be part of something. You don't not belong just because you're taking care of yourself. Yeah.
Wow. I got to tell you, that really hit me very hard right here. I think what you said in the beginning really resonated with me, Robyn, and I appreciate that because I don't think I've never heard anyone say it in the way that you did about the co-experiencing of like community trauma and how that can be really impactful, and I really felt that because, as I talked about earlier, like this being the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and its aftermath, I think so many of us who were frontline responders, really actually co-experienced that as a community. And so I really appreciate both just you giving words to that. So thank you. You like done like a great service to me just by saying those words, and giving like permission to actually feel that. So I just want to really appreciate you for that. And then I think that cycle that you talked about of rest and rejuvenation and healing is so important. I think for all the social change roles, but again, for this one in particular, because there's so much that's being held inside, it is critical. So that takes me to my last question, which is, what do frontline responders need from their ecosystems? You mentioned, you've been mentioning it a little bit here and there. How do frontline responders lean on others? What is it that they need to ask for from others in their ecosystem? And I'm curious for you, in your ecosystem, in your social change ecosystem, and I know we have many, but when you play the frontline responder role, who do you lean on the most? Like, are there certain roles that you lean on the most? You mentioned earlier about you needed someone to tell you to take a break. And that reminded me of like needing caregivers, right? In our ecosystem. So two questions. Yeah. One being, what do frontline responders need from others? And number two, for you, who do you lean on when you're playing the role of the frontline responder?
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think leaning on visionaries and storytellers in frontline response work is really necessary. I think oftentimes there's a really tight-knit relationship between like frontline responders and disruptors, just because of like the nature of disruption and the need for response to that. But to be in like close community and close relationship with visionaries, to be able to zoom out and see big picture and see, okay, I am not just putting out a bunch of tiny little fires. I am a part of a larger shift. And then, holding near and dear, like your caretakers and your healers as well. Permission to like, because there is an element of caretaking in frontline response work. So then also like giving yourself permission to be on the receiving end of that caretaking.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. One of my real recognitions, I guess, earlier on in my work was recognizing that I did not have a lot of caregivers when I was playing the role of a frontline responder. And that really helped me because it helped me there were caregivers, of course, in my life, but I didn't necessarily lean on them or ask them for support. And so again, just recognizing that it's okay to ask, it's okay to say, could you check in on me while I'm working on this campaign for the next month, or while I'm actually supporting these protests for the next week? I really need that support. So I think asking for that is something that we also should get in the habit of doing, because I think there's so many people who are willing to support. They might not know exactly how, but when asked, they will deliver for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's been something that I've had to learn as well, because I also play a caregiver role in a lot of spaces. So figuring out how to be on the receiving end of that as well is difficult. And I found that I have to be proactive about it. Because, if I'm already in the thick of the thing, or if I've already experienced it, or if the protest is over, I don't have anything left to ask for the support. So I need to put these things in place so that someone can check on me, or if I just really need a hug, or just being proactive in creating the care that I want to receive in the same way that I'm being proactive about creating the world that I want to live in.
Yeah. 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 So, I mean, just to kind of look back on some of the gems that you've dropped with us, I'm taking away this importance of preparation at one level. Preparation for frontline responders could look like understanding the spaces that they're going into through observation, internal preparation, preparing our ecosystems to say, hey, could you look after me? I need you for this or that. Really heard you talk about these grounding practices that can help people who are frontline responders to stay connected to self during conflict, during chaos or crisis. The importance of asking for consent and securing consent, not making assumptions, checking the ego at the door when playing the role of a frontline responder. And then, of course, like really connecting to others in the ecosystem. You mentioned specifically visionaries, storytellers who remind frontline responders, what is our North Star? Why are we doing this? This isn't just like this one moment in time. This is for this purpose. And also caregivers and healers to support when you need to go through that cycle that you talked about of rest and healing and regeneration. So thank you so much, Robyn. I've learned so much, and I know others have as well. And I also feel like, I'm so grateful to you for playing this role of a frontline responder. It is not an easy role to play. And so grateful to you, and hope that you have that support that you need, in your ecosystem, that you need to kind of continue playing this role to your best ability. And is there anything you want to share with us about anything you're working on now, or that you want people to know about?
I think my next thing is in the lens of, frontline response work, is the Blasian March is upcoming. What is the date on that? It's October something or other. It's like the third Saturday in October.
Can you say what it is for folks who might not?
Yeah, it's the Blasian March. And it's an action on really bringing together in solidarity Black and Asian and Blasian communities. So that's what I'm gearing up for right now in terms of like frontline response things, and I'm super excited about it. I have a planning call tomorrow. It's going to be great. And then I think like if there's other things, like you can usually find me over at Frontline Queers on Instagram. That's where I like try and, even if I can't be there myself, try and amplify the calls for like frontline response, okay. Whether that's like marches or mutual aid or what have you. Because as much as frontline response is like, boots on the ground, it is also networking and information and building networks, early warning, early response. Like there are so many other ways to plug in if like frontline response is your role. And that's something that's super important to me, because if you're called to this, if this is your role in social change ecosystems, there are so many intricacies and different ways that you can plug in. It's not just marching every day. There are so many different ways. Yeah.
Great. And the Blasian March is October 16th in New York City.
Yes, it is.
And there are many marches happening around the country, right, in the next month, whether it's for reproductive justice and other purposes. So there are lots of ways in which folks can be trained to be frontline responders. Yes. There are upstander trainings that often happen if you're interested in learning about that as a vehicle for being a frontline responder. So there are ways to develop the skill sets and
absolutely.
Get engaged. Yeah, if you would like. So with that, I'm just, again, grateful to you, Robyn, for this conversation. I really hope we can meet in person sometime soon. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, for being part of our ecosystem. You can watch the other parts of the series if you like. They're up on Building Movement Project our Instagram. And next month in October, we will be talking about the role of the experimenter and what that means. So if you're interested in that, please make sure that you follow us so you know when that conversation is. So thank you again, everyone. Please take care of yourselves. Please take care of those around you. And Robyn, really appreciate you. And with that,
thank you for having me.
Yeah, we will see you next month on Instagram Live. Thanks, everyone. Take good care of yourselves. Bye.